Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. And one of the things that I want to dig into today, and this is going to be an interesting topic, both in terms of topic and guest, is more and more of us are trying to figure out, how we might go about using AI. We're also trying to figure out, how much our companies are going to kind of get in the middle of that, those ambitions. And I want to dig into a topic that came up on one of the podcasts that I listened to, Software Defined Talk. Most of you are probably familiar with that because Brendan and Matt have been on the show for various times. But today, I get to bring the great Michael Cote on today, and I want to dive in with him on a comment that he made on their year-end show. So, Cote, welcome to the show finally.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan, first-time guester.
I actually think you were on. And you probably don't remember this because it's been a really long time. You were on one time with Andrew Clay Schaefer and James Waters. We were in California for the Pivotal Cloud Foundry event. It was a roundtable thing. So
I'll have to look that up. Huh? Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
Sorry.
this would have been probably 10 plus years ago. So
yes,
it's new for most people. New for
most
listeners.
Back in the King of Paz days.
That's right.
Days that I miss. I never got to find out who that person was. So maybe one day.
I want to dive into a topic. So you and the guys at Software Defined Talk, we're having a kind of a year-end walkthrough of things, and the topic of AI came up. And you brought up, and this may have just even been a throwaway comment, but I thought it was sort of an interesting topic. You have very publicly been talking about how you use AI, which I think is great. And you sort of said, but I have some worries about the ethics of using it like for internal stuff, right? And I think the context of it was like, well, what if I like make some great stuff and somebody's like, did you actually do that?
Right.
So let's do this first before we dive into that. How do you use AI today? Because I think you've been very kind of open about like you're trying to create workflows, you're trying to do stuff. Like, how do you use it?
Yeah. Well, so I'll start with the not fun with work and then go to the fun. But I think in a professional work context, I use it for brainstorming. And brainstorming is too open of a word, ironically, for what that is. But I use it to basically give a pile of stuff and ideas and say, do something with that. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is kind of like back when I did corporate strategy a while ago. Like that was, I was the AI. The executives would kind of like have ideas of like, we should buy this company or we should enter this market or we should do that. And you'd talk with them for like 10 minutes and they'd be like, can you write me a memo by 3 p.m.? And, you would just like write them a memo. And of course they would ask you knowing that you had opinions and that you had the knowledge. But a lot of times I use it for that kind of function. And then I don't do this so much, but sometimes I use it to learn about something in a work context. And I don't know if it says something about me or what I work on, but I don't really have to do that very much.
Yeah.
like I don't need to have it explain concepts to me because I don't know. Also, it has this issue of I think John Siracusa calls it the plumber problem, where the things I'm interested in, I'm expert on enough that like if I were to see someone do it in a movie, it would ruin the experience of the movie for me, right? Like the idea being that like when a plumber's watching a movie and they do some basic plumbing, they're probably like, that's not how you do it.
Right.
And so like the explanations it gives aren't that good. So then the second thing that I do is it's kind of like that, but I would call it the write me a first draft type of thing where, I mean, it's very difficult to start from nothing or even start from brainstorming.
Right.
But if you have a first draft, even if this is a core thing you learn in writing, is like the most important thing about a first draft is that it exists.
Right.
And like you can totally delete it and get rid of it, but at least it anchors on doing something that you can start with. So a lot of times I'll have it do some first draft of something. And then the next category is, this gets to things that there's a line of, what would you call it? Privacy? I don't know what you call that in a corporate context that I don't really cross with AI stuff. Is I might have it actually suggest strategy to me. Like, what should we be doing? How would we fit into doing this? Like, give me what I think you and I and other people would call like a strategy memo, right? And the issue there is, as much as I don't know if this is dangerous to say, as much as I don't agree with the policy, like, you're not supposed to do corporate stuff very much, secret corporate stuff in AIs, even though I know how to go select the thing that says don't train it, whatever, right? Like I grew up in the era of instant messaging spreading and all of that stuff. So I kind of know like this is not their best approach, blah, blah, blah. But I enjoy my job. So there's a certain line where it's like, unless I'm working on something that is based on public knowledge and is for public consumption, I don't really use the AI for it very much. Right. So it's mostly like, and I'm lucky in that my role, I shouldn't say pretty much, a huge amount of what I do is for public consumption and is based on public knowledge. Right. But there are some times, so for example, I guess the gray area for me is if it's thinking I am trying to do that is something a little beyond common sense. So for example, at the beginning of a year, when you work in a marketing function, or like yourself, you travel around a lot, you might be like, so how should I decide what conferences to speak at, right? Or like, given this IDC write-up, and by the way, I would never upload an IDC PDF to AIs. I'm sure that violates all sorts of problems. But given this chunk of text or write-up that I have, what is the marketing strategy that we would have, right? And to me, that's a lot different than like, here are 4 hours of an internal meeting where we talked about strategy, write me a strategy memo. Like, I definitely don't do that kind of thing. Right. I would like to. But now the fun stuff is, and I guess I should add, like, again, in that filtering of outside of the firewall thinking and corporate work, right? To put it one way, I don't do this as much as you might think, but I sometimes will do like proofreading and help me rewrite this thing. And the most extreme version of all of that, and especially that I've done, is I used Claude for a while, and you can train Claude to write in a style. So I loaded a lot. I used to write columns for the Register, I think, for a couple of years every month. So I loaded a bunch of those into it. And then I loaded some of my more recent texts from my newsletter. And it learned my style. And so I kind of took the pile of ideas that I had and I was like, write this for me. And it like was amazingly good. Right. And as I've joked several times, it was in fact so good, which I guess is a form of not being good, but I would have to be like, whoa, let's have a little less jokes in here. Right. Right. Like, let's tone it down a little bit. And that was an interesting experiment for me to reflect on, because I reached a limit. You and I are having a conversation recently about how you talk about things you don't know about, which is a slightly mischaracterization of it, but it's a good way of putting it. And I reached the point with this Claude thing where I no longer knew what I was writing about, so I couldn't feed it ideas. Which is the interesting, like, cul-de-sac of potential. So there's that kind of stuff that I do. Now, the third thing, which I probably talk publicly the most about, is I use it a lot to play Dungeons and Dragons or D&D. And it seems a little childish, although like all things from our youth, it is now an adult sport. Right. Whether it's collecting plushies or playing D&D or things like that, it's considered a fully mature adult thing for a gentleman who's 48 years old to do. But I think that in doing this, I've learned a tremendous amount about what to do with AI, because you're really pushing it to the limit, as I've discovered, of like what it can do. And you spend a lot of time coaching it and exploring and seeing it break. So it's a good way of like road testing what goes on there. And like there's two things. I know I'm going on here, but like to be very thorough in my answer, there's two things I think that I find really valuable about that. I've been doing it for a couple of years now, experience. One is it really helps you understand that generative AI stuff is in no way creative or imaginative. Like whenever you're going along with a D&D adventure and kind of like doing it itself, you can see that everything it's doing is based on what's already happened.
Right.
Like it doesn't really, I haven't messed with the temperature and things like that, but it doesn't really like come up with the randomness that you might have. And so you can very quickly, if you're paying attention to it, you can reverse engineer the whole predictive nature of what it's doing. You're like, oh, I see why we're at a wizard's tower, because that's statistically what always happens in this situation, right? Yeah. Like, and then the second thing that I've learned from it is I was talking with I don't know, I would call him like our chief product strategy whatever person for AI at here at Tanzu, and going over how I play with D&D, and he was like, "Oh, you've basically on your own invented agentic AI," which is to say, like when you're playing D&D, you have to constantly keep track of the context, the state of the game that you're playing, and figure out how to feed it this context, how to do things like break out, like call functions out to do role playing. You also have to save the state of the adventure, and also maintain your own stuff. So if you think about like at the moment on January 13th, 2025, what agentic AI means, it's basically like you're keeping track of the memory of what's happening, and you're also giving the AI access to like write out what's happening and call out to external things. You're building an application around it, right? Yeah. And like, if you want to do that over months with AI playing D&D, you got to manually do that yourself.
Right. No, that's interesting, because you hit on a lot of different things. I mean, there was aspects of what you're talking about where you're like, hey, I'm looking, essentially, like you're saying, like I want a brainstorming group, but except it happens to be the computer. Yeah. In some cases, you're like, I want like an assistant or an editor. Which, you know, a lot of us would love to have, and which we sort of get, except we do it and we send it around to people and they go like, it looks good to me. You know, I don't want to spend the time doing it. But the last part of it that I'm curious about, and I suspect you're going to get a lot of people that are like, you know, how do I do the D&D thing? Because that seems interesting. Is at what point, you know, going back to sort of the comments you made on the other podcast, was like, at what point do you sort of go, how am I, like, this would be my thought process, is like, how, as the thing is suggesting stuff to you or fixing stuff for you, or even like you said, like you give it your personality, your style, and it creates something. At what point would you potentially go, well, how is this any different than the software developer who uses a Copilot type of tool? And, you know, like, did they write that code? No, but because the system knows a little bit about like a pattern or a style or something, that it, you know, it's just a tool. It's just a thing to augment what you do. And I think that's sort of an interesting sort of dividing line between, because I think people are going to reach a point where they go, I would like to be better at my job because that offers me a chance to make more money, get promoted, have recognition. But at the same time, I need to know how far I can push that before somebody says, was that really your work? And if that's not your work, like, we don't need you anymore. Like that, to me, that feels like sort of the dividing line.
Yeah. No, you don't want to, you know, the joke I always try to make with programmers is like, never tell people your job is easy. Right. Like you don't get paid well for doing easy stuff. And I think, you know, to give the brief answer, I think in the next couple of years, like, it'll be up to individuals to figure out how to not AI themselves out of a job, right? Like I forget if it was you or someone else I was listening to recently, but they were saying that like at this time, the benefit for doing AI stuff mostly accrues to the individual user, because enterprises haven't figured out how to apply it broadly. Just like I was saying, right? Like there's you can really only use it for stuff outside of the firewall unless you've got like multi-million giant dollar projects going on, right? And so like I think when the to use communist terms, when the worker like has control over their tools, they are the ones who have to think about if this tool is going to make me less valuable and therefore jeopardize my income, if not my job. right?
Right.
And so I just think that's going to be the state for a while. I basically restated your question. And I think there's two approaches. One is to be open about it and to basically start off to set the expectation of like, I'm using AI stuff to write this. And so therefore, you are not going to be surprised or like pearl clutching that like you've been not doing this work, right? Because I think that's one way you get in this trap of devaluing your work is, I mean, I can only speak to Western work culture, but we've got this hangover from Protestantism that if you haven't suffered, there has been no value that's happened, right? And so like I think that very much so persists in especially American, but also in general Western work culture is like, we call it work, not leisure, right? So like you need to have done something. And so I think if you're upfront about that, then people won't be shocked when they find out that you've used it, and they won't like get this almost like in their cultural DNA reaction that therefore you're not valuable anymore. And then I think the second thing is, I mean, I don't even know if there's a second thing other than hiding it. I think you have to. There is a second thing that's like figuring out how to. I'm just going to go with the calamitous way of putting it, how to hide it. But I think there's a third middle path, which is, take the perspective of the corporation and figure out how you can be more productive because you're doing this, right?
Right.
So, like, if I am able to write a 40-page white paper in, let's say, a 20th of the time because I'm using Claude or whatever, then I should probably take, let me see if I can do the math. I should probably take 40 to 50% of that savings and do something else, right?
Sure.
And now, what you do with the other percentage just depends on what kids you have to pick up from school and how many dog walks you want to take, right? Like, exactly, I mean, I think to be a little bit whatever, I think the advantage that a worker has in the situation is, you get paid the same, so part of your profit should be more time to goof off. Or whatever, however you want to phrase it. But I think if you use this AI stuff more, then it means that just like with the programmer, like a programmer doesn't write in binary, they don't write in assembly, they don't write hopefully their own PDF generation thing, and instead they spend their time writing other stuff, and that's or doing other activities, and that's what you should shift onto to be overall valuable, even though you're doing a lot of your work with AI.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch because it brings up a lot of interesting scenarios, right? So if I just took your scenario, for example, there are plenty of companies who would go that are, in the technology space. You create all sorts of things that are relevant for marketing and for sales teams and for, how the company presents themselves publicly. So there's a ton of companies who would go, we would love to have Cote as our person that does those things, right? Let's assume that. So you get into some interesting scenarios. On one hand, the system is able to create things that sound like you because you've got a ton of experience that you've sort of kind of trained the system at a little bit to a certain extent, right? So you wouldn't get that if you didn't have somebody who started with value that the company had seen as valuable. On the other hand, and then you've got the second order piece of that, which is, how much time does your management chain or your company lawyers or brand or whatever it might be have to look over stuff and be like, did he write that or did he not write that? Right? Like it's a problem that like every professor and teacher has these days of like, did little Billy write this or did you just use, and if you had to guess, you would go, they don't really give you any feedback on most stuff you create anyways, because they're like, I'm too busy. I kind of, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
And then the sort of second order effect of that becomes, and this will be sort of interesting, is like, let's suppose there's a bunch of things you create on behalf of your current company. And, 2 or 3 years down the road, it's like, oh, I go work for somewhere else. Does the company say, keep giving me that kind of output AI, except don't give me the Cote flavor of it? Or can you separate the Cote flavor of it from the way that it processes and thinks through some stuff? So, I mean, it feels like, I guess the thing I'm getting at is like, there's probably some ethical discussion to have, whatever ethics means to people, but it also feels like you're like, all right, if I put a pin in it right now where we are, and how many systems or how many steps need to be in place before somebody's like, I'm checking that, it feels like a pretty big gap, multi-year gap.
Yeah, I mean, I like that perspective because it's you've got two things in contrast there, right? Like the way that you would think about people using AI in an academic context, I think is a lot different than a corporate context. And in fact, just last night, I was using the whatever they call it, the talk out loud thing with ChatGPT to help my son study. And we were basically using it as if we brought a teacher in and just asking questions and saying, how would you do this? I mean, as a teacher, right? And my wife, Kim, she said, Cormac, maybe don't say that we use ChatGPT for this, because the school world has a much different view of ChatGPT than the corporate world, right? And and I think that is, so to get to this ethics point, I think you've got to like separate at least into those two swim lanes, right? Like if the question is, you have to prove that you know and did this thing, then of course you can't. I mean, that's what plagiarism is. You can't just use ChatGPT as a lying machine, to falsify that you learned and know something, right? But those words are too loaded to then apply to a corporate context, because in the corporate context, you want an outcome, and the outcome you don't care how that's achieved. So to go back to the programming thing, if a programmer is like, I discovered this existing library exists that will take care of 4 weeks of our work, that person that's gonna be part of why they got a bonus that year, right? And so like similarly, and this is kind of, I think, what was evoking that ethic things is like, but that understanding, I don't know if that spreads beyond engineering as pervasively, right? So like as an example, there's a lot of internal corporate communication that people spend, and I'm sure you have, and I've been involved in this a lot, thankfully not that much over the years, but you'll spend weeks crafting like the perfect internal presentation or the perfect internal email. And I kind of sort of feel like, I think you could just talk to the AI and within less than an hour probably get something that will get the job done, right? Yeah. And like, I think that's ethical.
Right. Well, I mean, if we were being really honest with ourselves, it's, if you were to feed like, I don't know, an entire year's worth of like press releases, for example, which you've worked on those, like those things take weeks and weeks and weeks to get every word right. If you fed them in from 1,000 companies and said, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to just summarize me what's different about these things, like it probably would come back and be like, there's about 1% difference. Like, because they're kind of the same. If you looked at most internal presentations, they're kind of the same. Like, I kind of get to the point of as you brought up the issue and you mentioned ethics, and it might not even been what you were kind of deeply thinking about. I'm like, I don't think there's that much from the day-to-day stuff that sort of white collar work does that is that different. I think that, and we don't really value it. We don't really value it for being all that different. And in the academic sense, like there's a distinct line of like plagiarism is, right and wrong, allowed, not allowed. Whereas in corporate world, even for things that are like legal, those are sort of gray lines, right? Like if you, for example, you were writing some code and you were like, well, I borrowed some code from something I found on GitHub. Like that's fine unless you get into a situation where you go, well, I included some code that has a different license than what we do, and now legal might get involved. Right? Like that's a gray line, but everything else feels like, yes, you could individually feel like you violated some ethics by saying like, I borrowed somebody's work, but then if you're using the AI, like whose work are you borrowing?
Yeah,
Right?
and so maybe I mean maybe that is why I think if you the being upfront about using it, that isn't what makes it ethical. I think it just obviates the whole quandary about it, right? And I was trying to articulate that earlier is like I think a lot of when a worker or a group of people relies on a tool to automate what they're doing, a lot of the what word am I looking for? The negative view of that is based on because people think they were portraying themselves as doing the work and really something else is doing it, right? And so if you're just upfront that you're using the tool, I think the whole ethics part gets removed. And like as an analogy, like I don't think anyone, well, for various completely separate reasons, I don't think anyone thinks using management consultants are unethical.
Right.
And you're basically, that's like the executive suite
Same thing. Yeah.
using ChatGPT to come up with strategy. Now, obviously, I'm making a bit of a mockery, et cetera, so forth, whatever. But like, it's paying someone to do work that you are not going to do yourself, that you are then presented and kind of like basically use as your own. Right. And I even phrase that incorrectly. You're not using it as your own. You're acknowledging that you used McKinsey, Bain, whoever to do this work for you. Right. And so I think I would view it as a very similar thing of like, it's similar to just hiring management consultants or in marketing, hiring an agency to do something. And anyhow, I mean, and then the other thing is I think that you're making me think is that So then the other ethical thing, and ethics is, I don't, in this context, it's the wrong thing. The other dangerous thing for an individual or a company doing this is the old replacing workers thing, right?
Right.
And I think just as with the report that you get from the management consultants, that's kind of valuable, but now you have to go do it.
Right.
Right. And like execution and not only doing it, but putting in place, you probably know how to pronounce it. I'm always joking about this. What's that? The Welsh professor who came up with the chaos theory thing, Sinfin or whatever, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Like figuring out how to identify the 4 types of complex systems and therefore adapt the way that you're learning and reacting and running your organization. Like the AI is not going to do that for you. Probably. Right. I mean, and that comes back to, that's what I learned from D&D is like, you can't have the AI react to evolving market conditions. It'll just like not work. And it won't imagine. And so like anything, at least at the moment, that you're going to do with generative AI is incredibly valuable, but it's not going to do the work for you that comes after that.
Yeah. The more I'm talking, the more we're talking through this, the more I'm thinking like, if you use your sort of consultant example as something that people can tangibly think about, like, oh yeah, we've seen that before. I think what ends up happening, and we've seen this time and time again, where companies tend to go like, well, the people that we have aren't necessarily getting that done. We're going to augment that somehow. Maybe you're going to pay 5x what you're augmenting it for, whatever. And you invariably, you do this thing that they call kind of hollowing out your business, which is you take, you only think about sort of the extremes of it, of like, well, I've got the really low end work and I've got the really high end work, and everything in the middle, like we've outsourced, for example. Yeah. Right. And it'll be interesting to watch and see what happens, because like, to my point earlier, if whoever was managing your group said like, boy, they're really creating a lot of great stuff. It feels like they're creating 20-30% more than they used to. And then they find out, oh, but they've been using ChatGPT, and maybe they find out, oh, you've kind of taught the system some stuff. Then they run into the question of like, well, like you said, can I let the system just do the work, right? Which is, I think we're going to see a lot of people kind of struggling with that thought process of like, do I keep the people around? Do I let the AI do the thing?
Yeah.
And then at some point, let's say you choose to let the AI do more of the work. At some point, the context has changed. The work has changed. Maybe not, you're still creating things, but like,
yeah,
the world has been like, well, no, we're no longer thinking about containers. We're now doing AI, or we're doing whatever's next. And nobody's nobody's taught the thing that context, right? Like that game is different.
Exactly. Yeah,
so
I think there's something interesting you're saying there, that like you're saying the work has changed, right? And I think that is okay. So now I think this area we're talking about is management's responsibility and management's game to mess up, to put it in family-friendly terms, right? And so what management should do when they discover this group that's been using AI is they should say, okay, if what I was asking you to do could be done by an AI, I should ask you to do better things, right?
Yeah.
And so to use a marketing example, I mean, I am I guess you could say I'm a fan of press releases, just not in the way most people would be. Like, I think press releases are great, and I won't burn up time talking about it. However, press releases are not great.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think they're not great because of a lot of well, to put it one way, because of the humans involved in it, right? Like a press release should be looked at as almost like, to be really old school, they're almost like EDI interchange. It's just sort of like the schema of how companies talk to other companies about things that they've done.
Yeah.
And like, unless you know how to read that schema, it seems like a bunch of crap to you, right? And so like, and yet humans have to produce this, so you've got to have people spend a lot of time on press releases. Well, instead of that, an AI could perfectly write a press release. And so instead of having you don't fire these people, because what's the number one thing every budget cycle, one of the top things people will say is like, I wish we could do more, right? I wish we had more budget. I need to hire more people. Well, instead of writing press releases in marketing, just have the AI do it. And now you have more people without having to actually have new budget, right? And so that is like what management needs to figure out with AI is like, to put it in a crass way, like, if the BS master, the AI can do, work, it was BS work in the first place, right? Just have it do it. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I mean, I don't really see a lot of discussion in all the bi-directional pearl clutching about like, well, now we can do better work.
Right. Yeah, everybody kind of wants to make it a binary. Do we keep the people? Do we not keep the people? Or, does it do the work or not do the work? It's the levels of gray in there that I think are going to be interesting. Because on one hand, you're going to run into the scenario you're talking about, which is like the smart people figured out how to get the system to be more efficient because they had context, they had experience and so forth. But at the same time, it's like, well, I don't necessarily want to pay all the people what I pay the really smart people or the experienced people or whatever, but I would like all the groups to get that level of benefit. And I think that's going to be a really interesting, it's sort of the same argument that people have made for a long time where they go, Netflix has publicly stated we only hire like the most qualified people. And you're like, well, that means you're probably hiring a lot of really expensive people. And it's like, well, yeah, but look at their results. Versus the companies who go, well, we could never do that. We can't afford to do that. And you're like, but those results are really appealing. Wouldn't you want results that look like that? And
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm suspicious of the whole premise of that Netflix
concept.
Maybe I'm too much of a Andrew Clay Schaefer disciple, right? But it just seems like or even more appropriate. He doesn't work there anymore, but Adrian Cockcroft had that famous slide or the famous story of like this is in the heyday of the 2010s or whatever, when the tech companies were going to take over everything, and he's like, I in his gentle Scottish accent, I went and I was talking to a Fortune 100 CIO, and they were like, but Adrian, we just don't have the people who can do this. And then Adrian was like, well, we hired them from you. Right. And so like, it just,
if you don't treat them well, Netflix will get you. If you don't treat them well, AI will hire your good people.
And I think, that's another point about AI stuff is, we'll see if this metaphor works. This is going into a boundary I know nothing about, but like, you get, if you have a bunch of like plaque in your bloodstream, you take pills to help remove that, and then you work more efficiently. And I think in any large organization, you have negative bureaucracy, things that are clogging up your system. And if you can have AI stuff come in and remove that plaque for you, then your job is to be a better company, not like downsize, right? Like your job is to actually grow and come up with new things. And without the challenge I would give is to be like, without getting more budget, how do you do more? Right? Like, I mean, that's the kind of thing that like corporate managers should want to do. Like, don't worry about reducing budget because you can't do more with less. Like that
normally
it doesn't work. But you could do more if you had less you had to do.
Yeah.
I'll have to write that one down.
That's right. Put it on a sign behind your head there. And everybody can remember it. Well, good. I'm gonna wrap up with that analogy because I think if we get into too many more, we're gonna get way over our skis and get into stuff we can't talk about. But well, listen, for folks that now that you are officially a Cloudcast alumni, what are ways that people can go find all the stuff that you're potentially creating or potentially creating with AI? They can determine which one it is.
Well, as you very kindly said at least once, if not a couple of times, I do a lot of stuff in my newsletter, which is at newsletter.cote.io. And I think I said this on Software Defined Talk, my podcast with Brandon and Matt. I got a significant amount of subscribers that time that you did it, so it works. You can put that in your buy ads from us collateral.
Get out there and sign up. Click the subscribe button.
But yeah, it's all in there. And then as Brian has said, if you go to softwaredefinedtalk.com, you can enjoy that podcast. And if you've listened this far, I'm sure you've heard about it on this podcast.
Good stuff. Good stuff. We will put all those links in the show notes so you don't have to remember them while you're driving or walking or going for a run or whatever you're doing. Cote, thank you for the time today. I don't know that we definitively answered anything, but we were talking about ethics, so there are no definitive answers. But
that's right.
Hopefully the stuff gives you some things to think about. I know you've been publishing a lot about how you're doing these things, so those are all good reads. They're in the newsletter. And with that, folks, we'll wrap up, and we will talk to you next week.